in a modern setting, it's almost unfathomable that something like this could have happened. Of course, anymore, you couldn't take a lot of things that happened even, you go back into, what was it, I get the decade right, the 30s, when Roosevelt, had his polio and nobody knew, because they kept it away and they had the press never take pictures of him. They, tunneled him in through secret corridors so that he could always be there in his vehicle, but how did he ever get in and out of it? All that stuff. That's probably the last of the hiding of an illness or hiding of a disease or whatever that probably has ever been or will be able to be done, because first of all, the paparazzi wouldn't let that happen. The 24-hour news cycle wouldn't let that happen. So we're in a point now where this story is that we're going to look at in chapter 4 is somewhat maybe unrepeatable in a lot of ways, that something could be as hidden as it was seemingly hidden from the people, because that never seems to come up. However, hidden as it was, Nebuchadnezzar decides he's going to broadcast it to everyone. So he starts dreaming again. We had this already in chapter 2. In chapter 4, it is Nebuchadnezzar's words. He is recounting events that transpired in the form of how he writes it as an open letter written by Nebuchadnezzar to the whole world. He wants everybody to know what happened to him. He could have easily swept it under the rug. He could have hid it, because I don't think during the time it happened, the way he kind of writes this to let everyone know with very great detail everything that happened, I'm not certain he wasn't able to kind of hide this away with the people underneath him taking charge temporarily and kind of, stepping in that, whatever the vice president type of role would have been under Nebuchadnezzar in their system, stepping in and filling in the gaps so that people may not have known what happens to him during this. It was humiliating. And humiliating as it was, he chooses to share his experiences with the world, which gives us this letter. Now, from about Daniel early chapter 2 through chapter 7, it's written in Aramaic, which is also, think of Aramaic as kind of like the English of the day back then. Where now, if you were going to write a letter to the world, you're going to write it in English, right? Because that's the most common language. Well, we'd write it in English because it's the only one we know, because this is America, right? But if you did know another language, if you spoke another language, you probably wouldn't choose that language as the language to reach the most people. Same thing with Aramaic. So the beginning of Daniel's in Hebrew, the end of Daniel's in Hebrew, but that middle section of it, largely dealing with Nebuchadnezzar, is written in Aramaic, including this letter that he writes. And so it is really meant for everyone to read it. Starts off, King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and people of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. So he doesn't take it upon himself like, I can't believe I'm even telling you this. You're not going to believe what happened to me. But, he kind of goes into this thing of, it's my pleasure to tell you what signs and wonders. And so he looks at it a little bit differently than I think probably a lot of us would look at this. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I think it's also interesting to kind of note on this one, it would be really easy for us to look at chapter 4 in its entirety, and as we look at it, to make some sort of assumption that King Nebuchadnezzar has maybe converted to Judaism. And that is not the case. You'll see this kind of show itself up a little bit later. But what he has done is he's gained a huge understanding of God's capabilities, his power, his might. He's also gained a huge amount of respect. And remember, we've talked a little bit about this. While it's not going to be as obvious in chapter 4 as it is in other chapters, this is leading to something. This building up of respect allows for people like Daniel to coast through the reigning time period of Nebuchadnezzar and those who follow in a really high position of authority, which is going to set the stage for when the Medes and the Persians take over. All right, so he says in verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. And I think we see this again. These are not dreams. He says it's a dream, but he really talks to them about visions. And I think it becomes a little bit different than just a standard dream. We talked about that in chapter 2 for those who are here that particular time. He knew there was something more to it. We see throughout several passages of Scripture, particularly in Chronicles, Kings, and Ezekiel, that working with Nebuchadnezzar was God's doing. He wanted the Israelites to work with that kingdom rather than turning and working with the Egyptians. And so he had a plan for them. When they wouldn't go about doing it that way, he stirred and moved Nebuchadnezzar to come take over them and bring them there. He stirred and moved Nebuchadnezzar to have a vision of all the kingdoms that were yet to come, which then ultimately brought Daniel into this high position of authority. And now he basically is going to give him another vision that terrifies him, because I think he knows this one has to do with me yet again. Remember, he has already had one dream in which he was the gold head of an extremely large statue that crumbles into pieces. Oddly enough, even though he has this dream of a huge statue, in chapter 3, he goes about and he builds some sort of huge statue that everyone has to worship. Now in chapter 4, he has another dream. He says, so I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream. Now remember, last time he wouldn't do that. Last time he would not tell them the dream. He wanted them to interpret it for him. This time he gives them an opportunity. I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. Again, that's why I would say I don't think we see him fully converted, because this is after the events have transpired. He refers to him as like, oh, I called him Belteshazzar because I used to follow this God or whatever. He still refers to it as my God. And I think that's why I think we don't see that he's turned from his pagan ways. But we do see that he says that, you know what, I'm sorry, I just realized I made a mistake real quickly. I'm sorry, Josh, I about passed by your verse. I wanted him to read something for us here. Josh, if you're ready, I want you to read for us again, because I think this is where we're going to really kind of see this idea. He's going to read Daniel chapter 4, verse 3 for us. So if you're ready, Josh.
Yes, sir, man.
All right.
Great are your sons, as mighty his wonder, his kingdom, as the turn of kingdom, these living doers with generation. Matt,
All right. Thank you, Josh. And I think if you see that, that's coming from someone who still claims a different God. And I think for him to say that and then still reference his God, yet this God in every way, shape, and form, in his mind even, seems to be greater than the God that he was following. So he says in verse 9, I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here's my dream, interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it, every creature was fed. In the vision I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree, trim off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. I think at this point, Nebuchadnezzar probably already knows something about that tree, kind of how he kind of knew he was part of that statue in chapter 2. And my guess is this is what becomes troubling about it. If I dreamed that somebody was going to cut down a tree, I don't think I'd be terrified, unless in that vision that God had put into my head, it became obvious to me that that's not a tree. And, understand too, remember, the people who come after him are iron and bronze, also silver too. It doesn't mention that one. But again, I think that you could almost see some of the parallels from the previous dream, that he can kind of see this has something to do with this same kind of idea there. It says, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. All right, so now it went from talking about a tree to now he's going to reference it as the messenger went from talking about it as a tree to him. And so it goes from, an inanimate object, or I guess, a living object, but the tree in and of itself as that, to now into this person kind of reference here. And he says, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal till 7 times passes by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms of earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets them over the lowliest of people. So again, on this one, there is an interesting parallel. In chapter 2, we see the head of gold, the chest of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, and the feet of iron, and then that. And on this one, we also see the stump that's being left. Now, you could probably go too far down that interpretive path and assume that this means that his kingdom is going to be cut down, and then it's going to be tied up, and the roots of it would still be into those other kingdoms. And you could try to push yourself way down the line here and assume that nothing that actually happens to Nebuchadnezzar has anything to do with this. But I don't think that's what this is about. I think what we're seeing here is that we're seeing that there's just a parallel from the first dream kind of indicating more to him. If the same materials are being talked about, it's probably coming from the same source. And this is, again, a message from God. So I think that's where, and I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that they want to throw in or kind of add to that. I think one of the big challenges here is to not overinterpret outside of what the scripture gives us. So when we look at this, what we see is the interpretation that Daniel is going to give us is probably the one that is, I would say, probably the best approach to take on that. All right, so let's go into that. So this time he didn't feel the need to search anyone else to interpret the dream. He went straight to the one who could do it. Kind of. He didn't feel the need to put them to death. Interestingly, he didn't go, I probably shouldn't put he went straight to the one. He went quickly to the one, it's probably a better word, rather than straight to the one. He did have some other ones that were probably closer to him, but then they couldn't do it, so he goes to the chief of the magicians, which is Daniel. And so that's where he gets his solution there. All right, so this is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means. For none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. I think Nebuchadnezzar knew something already. I think he just needed to hear it for himself. And that's why if what he thought the dream's interpretation wasn't getting confirmed by those other ones, it's not going to be right. So Belteshazzar answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. Your Majesty, you are that tree. That's one of the most bold statements that Daniel could make right there, because again, he's talking to essentially the most powerful guy out there who could put him to death for saying anything like this. He's already, in his anger before, tried to put his friends to death. And so all of these things, he's not, he's not already showing any signs of weakness here at Daniel. He is really, truly laying it out there for him. He's like, all right, you saw that dream, and everything you saw, that's you. Which means the rest of the interpretation that you saw, by the way, is also you. And so he goes on and he says, Your Majesty, you are that tree. You've become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. I think it's a true statement to say that Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest king of the Babylonian and add in the Medo-Persian times. You could argue that Alexander the Great in the Greek Empire may have outdone Nebuchadnezzar in land grab. You could probably argue that most of the leaders of the Roman Empire actually, while maybe inferior in some aspects as kingdoms, you could probably make an argument for why they may have had more control over more people and more areas. But during the time of the Babylonians and the Medo-Persian Empire, He reigned the longest. He became the greatest individually. And so there was a lot to that. So this was really bold for Daniel to go up to the most powerful man on earth who had lived up until that time and for generations to come, essentially the most powerful leader, and just to say, yeah, you're going to be cut down. You're going to have your demise. You're that tree. So this is a bold statement right there. He says, Your Majesty saw a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times passed for him. This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. And it's, again, that's kind of goes back to the reason you have the Israelites in your possession right now is because God did that, not you. And he needs to be taken down a few notches. God has a purpose and a use for Nebuchadnezzar in his grand plan. And the problem was Nebuchadnezzar was getting a little too big for his britches. He was starting to get a little too confident, a little too full of himself, and surrounding himself with all these people who, my lord the king, how great you are, how great you are. That's all he heard day in and day out. I mean, think about it, as a king over all of this, all he would have heard every single day is, you're so wonderful, you're so wonderful, you're so great, you're the greatest, you're so wonderful, you're so wonderful. After a while, you hear that enough, you might start to believe it, or you really will start to believe it. And everything about you becomes that. And so even with that kind of, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've heard those phrases. I think we see it played out exactly through Nebuchadnezzar there. 7 times will pass until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign. That's what this letter is about, his acknowledgement. Because he has to go through the valley to get to the next mountaintop there is basically what he has. He's on this high peak of his reign. He is the greatest. This tree has grown where everybody in the world is fed because of him. Everybody in the known world is cared for because of him. Everybody in the known world knows him and respects him because of who he's become. And he says, it's about to all be taken away from you. Oops, hit the button twice. So he says, all this happened. I think I skipped one. Sorry, go back one more. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. There are some interpretations that try to take this and try to push it too far into the future and say that the iron and the bronze, the Greeks and the Romans hold the place of this kingdom until it gets restored again later. But that wouldn't make any sense to what Daniel said. Daniel says, your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, Your Majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be then that your prosperity will continue. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. 12 months has gone by. Now, can you remember what was said during the first sermon of May last year? Probably not, right? We don't remember things for 12 months. Even as troubling as this was, think about 12 months ago and what thoughts would have been going through your head. My guess is, with the busyness of running a kingdom, with all of the people who were constantly, you are so great, you're so wonderful, you're amazing. By the way, did we forget to tell you? We love you, you're amazing, you're great. After a while, 12 months, day in and day out of hearing that, my guess is he's a little puffed back up once again. And there he is, walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And this is the same place that had one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. He built a lavish city. And as he's walking around on the royal palace of Babylon, there on the roof, he said, is not this great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? And you can hear him you can almost picture this. Him just kind of standing back, looking over this whole city saying, this is amazing. And this is all my doing. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to be in maybe like an observation deck, whether it's like in New York or, overlooking, one of those tightly packed cities. I remember standing up on it was been 10, 11 years ago. We were in Barcelona, Spain, and we were up on the old Olympic grounds where they had the 92 Olympics. And it's overgrown and everything now, but you're up in that area. It overlooks the whole city over there, and you can look out over that. And I can imagine if I had built that whole city, I might stand up there and start falling into the same trap he fell into, especially if every day everyone told me how great I was. You'd start to buy into this press, and so he buys into this, and he says, man, look at what I've done. Look at me. Him puffing his chest out and proud of himself there. 12 months of being praised by everyone around you will change you. It's not, there's a certain amount of, everybody needs that attaboy, but 12 straight months of attaboys are probably not the best for humility. And so you get that issue that crops up and sneaks into his life over and over. He knew, Daniel told him, maybe if you change your ways just a little bit, quit being a sinner, which again, is just amazing that Daniel was said this to Nebuchadnezzar, because he interpreted the dream and then some. And he's like, and by the way, if you quit being so prideful and wouldn't be a sinner, maybe these things wouldn't happen to you. So, he was bold. Don't lose sight of what Daniel said to this guy. And so he knew he was supposed to be less prideful. But his inner circle constantly praising him. He gets a little bit prideful. And it's interesting, even as the words were on his lip, a voice came from heaven. This is what I decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. And he knew. When he said this, when these words, as he's sitting there bragging, look at this great city of Babylon that I built for my majesty. King Nebuchadnezzar, I've decreed this for you. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You'll be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about King Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. I don't know at this point in time what the rest of those in Babylon knew. He appears to be up on the roof of the palace with maybe a few others. We don't know. We're not told who all was there. We don't know if they heard this. We don't know if they heard this and then he was driven away and then the changes started to really take place so that nobody really saw what it looked like. We don't know what they knew. We're not given that part of the information. I don't know for sure that Nebuchadnezzar knows what they knew at the time, and that maybe that's why he doesn't include this in there. But we do know that 7 years are going to go by. So he was driven away from people, ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew from heaven, and his hair grew like feathers of an eagle, and his nails like the claws of a bird. I can't even wrap my mind around. I've seen artist renditions of what he might look like on this, but I don't know if those are even right, of how hideous he started to look like. At the end of that time, 7 years, what year is it, 2021? 2014, that's a long time ago. We didn't even know what COVID was back then. This last 14 months has seemed like an eternity. Do that 5 more times. That's how long he was in his state of mind. Just walking around, crawling around, eating grass like he's an ox, looking like he's an overgrown man bird. I don't even know what this would look like, but he's just hideous. The most powerful man on earth. Can you imagine if 7 years went by when, one of our leaders were to be transformed into something like that? Now, again, we can't because, first of all, we have 4-year terms. So that's an issue that we'd have to see them at least once, for re-election. But The 7 years of time going by, like, can you imagine what would happen if they're missing for all this time? I think they're there. Maybe they are. I don't know. I haven't seen anything. I haven't heard anything from them. The kingdom's still running itself. I don't know that the people knew. We don't know how much they knew until this letter comes out. But he says, then I praised the Most High God. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven and my sanity was restored. Now, he could have done it earlier, sure, but God said, no, you're doing it for 7 years. I'm going to wait till 7 times pass by for you. Then you finally get your sanity back. So his sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. This is the second time he said this. He wants this understanding to be made known to the people that this is a kingdom that will not be shaken. It will go on. He was told that already in his previous dream, that this would be a God who would create a kingdom that would never be shaken. He says, all the peoples on the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples on the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? And think about it, we cannot ask God a question like that. If we don't learn anything out of the book of Job, I think we learn, like, how dare you? And I've said it before, you can almost see as Job starts to raise that finger up there, it's like, put that back down. Don't you dare try to make God answer to you. Who can stand up against him? And yet, look at what he does for us. And yet, look at how much he loves us, how great he is toward us. He holds all the power in his hand. Nebuchadnezzar tried to think he had all the power, and instead, God shows him who really did. At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. For 7 years, I guess they just didn't look for him. I don't know what happened. That's the strangest 7 years. And I don't know that he can give us the answer in his letter because he was insane for 7 years. He didn't have his sanity until the end of this. So he was restored to he says, I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven because of everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. You know, it's interesting when you look at this, 7 years of total insanity, it can really change you. It can really change your outlook on life. I don't know if that's really the takeaway there. The takeaway there, though, is, don't boast before God. Don't look at God with some sort of, look at how great I am. You can't do this without me, God, kind of attitude. It took a major event for Nebuchadnezzar to be taken down a few notches. Even though he actually is greater afterward, and it was really for his good in a lot of ways, it took a major, major fall for him to finally kind of wrap his mind around, okay, here's your place. God has given it to you. Be glad you have it. And quit puffing your chest out at him as though it's all because of you. Because guess what? It's not. We can always turn you back into a man bird anytime we want to. And we'll take it away. That's the kind of lesson he needed to learn there. So anybody have any thoughts on this chapter? Such an intriguing chapter in so many ways because, it's this concept and this idea that still pertains to us today. A lot of times when we see this, our first thought is we like to get political on things, right? I'm not going to get political. I'm going to be like as apolitical as I can. And it's still, when we read a book like this, our first thought of our mind goes is, I'd like to see insert name go crazy for a few years, or whatever. That's the way we want to do this. We want to take it that way. What we really need to be thinking as we read a chapter like this is, see, God is always in control. God puts in charge who he wants to put in charge. Whether you like that or not, Nebuchadnezzar oppressed a lot of people. They didn't really like it. Other people were mistreated under different things. God has a plan. God will put into charge who God wants in charge. That is really hard for us to handle when we are given a vote on it, because then it drives us insane of thinking, well, but. No, God puts in charge who God wants to have put in charge, and he will carry it out, allowing his plan to be accomplished. So what do? We sit back and put our focus where our focus should be, on his kingdom, his eternal kingdom. That's where our efforts and our thoughts and our cares should be. And that's a really hard thing sometimes to distance yourself when you're living in one and another at the same time, to realize we only really need to be focused in on the one and really truly devote ourselves and focus ourselves in that way. Anybody have any other thoughts, comments, criticisms? We'll leave those for another time. We're out of time, so.